So let me just say a bit embarrassingly, I'm a huge Peter Szendy fan, and I look forward with ever-renewed amazement and anticipation to where his mind will take him next. He's a philosopher of the full aesthetic sensorium, sound, the sound of music, over and under listening, punctuation, film, visibility, the faces of coin, hypermarkets. Peter is also an ami de la maison, by which I mean our Maison Française at NYU, where he's often lectured, and also our French and Comparative Literature departments, where he has offered extraordinary seminars. And I see a number of the students who have been the beneficiaries of those incredible teachings. We are delighted that he is now close by teaching at Brown University. This fall, Peter joined the Brown faculty as the David Herlihy Professor of Humanities and Comparative Literature. Before that, he taught in the Department of Philosophy at Paris-Ouest, Nanterre. And I'm not going to go into all of his publications, but relevant to our conference, he served as musicological advisor at the Cité de la Musique. He edited their major journal and book series at IRCAM. His publications on sound and music include À coup de poing, la ponctuation comme expérience, which is translated as of stigmatology. Another, Hits, Philosophy in the Jukebox, which came out with Fordham in 2012. Another, All Ears, The Aesthetics of Espionage. Another book called Listen, A History of Our Ears. All these, by the way, published in English by Fordham. And among his most recent publications, I highly recommend an article, All the Marxes at the Big Store, or General Fetishism, and Le Supermarché du Visible, which is forthcoming in English as The Supermarket of the Visible, or is it already out?
No, it's not out.
Not quite out, so we'll look forward to that. Unable to curb my enthusiasm, I will finish by sharing some hyperbolic descriptive phrases that I provided for the book jacket copy of the Of Stigmatology book. I found this book to be an exercise in calibrating life breath, an analysis of aesthetic expression through its different modal systems, of markers and points. I characterized it as a work of criticism that in its experimental form resembles a composition or score, a performance of poesis, a philosophy of the sensible that investigates how one makes a point philosophically and emotively. We were talking earlier in our discussion this morning about the passage from seriality to a kind of re-entry of ontology and subjectivism. And I would actually say that in Peter's work there is this understanding of not so much formalism, but scoring and punctuative for a kind of punctual sort of mode of representation, and this re-entry or renegotiation of the ontological. And what we find in this work that I really have taught and appreciated particularly is how to appreciate how diacritical markers from exclamation points, dashes, interrogatives, commas, full stops, quotation marks resonate existentially, marking the musicality of existence and its deep links to notation, the distance between points, the varying forms of intervallic spacing, so interval and also, I guess we could think more about interval from Mallarmé to Szendy. And the book calibrates, and here I'll conclude, moments also of acceleration and deceleration, the kind of pulse of the heart with excitement. And finally, he has almost a kind of pop cultural appreciation of graphics of various kinds of exclamation, the pows and blams of comic book blows, in which we also perceive, at least I do, glimmers of political violence and the tragicomic gesticulations of vaudeville. It's this kind of performative imagination that adds life to philosophical thinking. And I would say that Peter Szendy is a true virtuoso of this art. And so we will turn now to his talk on the art of listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily, for this extremely generous presentation. I'm very happy and honored to be here with friends, colleagues, students, and we should intertwine all these categories, colleagues and friends, students and friends, to be back here, actually. So in my talk on what I call the art of listening, and it's an expression borrowed from Nietzsche, I will try to bridge the distance between two works two publications that Emily generously quoted. The book that was actually in a way, my first book, Listen, A History of Our Ears, and the not last, let's say the forthcoming book in English that you mentioned, of stigmatology, dedicated to the question of punctuation. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm sorry, I have a slight cold, so I hope my voice won't betray me, but maybe it should be okay. So since you kindly welcomed me with some applause, I would like to, in a way, thank you for that and begin by showing you some kind of echo of your applause, a sort of mirror of that applause. So the applause that you just saw and heard has been staged by Alfred Hitchcock at the Royal Albert Hall in London for one of the most famous sequences in The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 1956 version. And then, after the applause, but I stopped the clip before, silence. Silence and waiting. What are they? What are we waiting for? For the concert, obviously. We wait for this festive moment when the finest and most attentive listening will be allowed to take delight in the music it expects. So many ears waiting silently. I will try to show you how these ears exercise their art, what strategies they develop, collectively or individually, what techniques also they use. In order to do that, I want to show you what happens when the music begins. As you will see and hear, it is a cantata entitled The Storm Clouds. It was composed by a composer named Arthur Benjamin for the first version of the film in 1934. It is well, neoclassical music, not of the best kind, I confess. But what interests us here is not the music as such. I'm sorry to say that, I mean, in this specific case, but rather, and this is why I sort of downplay in advance the importance of music as such here. What interests us is rather the tactics involved in listening to this music. The score, I should note, has been reorchestrated by Bernard Herrmann for this 1956 remake of the film, and he conducts it himself, by the way. So you will see Bernard Herrmann conducting in Royal Albert Hall. bad guy suspended, floating. So what happened? It was a bit long, but I think it was important to show you the whole sequence. We saw many things: the police, negotiating, passion, crime, tears, shouting, closed doors, forbidden accesses, applause, of course, just before. The scene is quite well known. There is a gun aimed at the foreign minister of an unidentified country, and the gun will be fired exactly at the moment when the cymbals will be heard in the orchestra, so that the crime goes unnoticed. Hitchcock, as you saw, alternates the shots, the killer in his theater box with his accomplice reading the score, following it bar after bar with her finger, the orchestra, the choir, the musicians, the conductor, the prime minister smiling, charmed by the music, the cymbal player looking at his part, at the empty bars that he has to count until the final clash, marked sforzando, the brief dialogue between Ben, James Stewart, and his wife Jo, Doris Day, dialogue that we do not hear because their voices are masked by the music, the killer's gun, now hidden behind the curtain of the box, the crescendo that runs through the pages of the conductor's score, leading inexorably to the clash that everybody waits for, right? The cymbal player now standing, ready to execute his one and only gesture, and last but not least, the big pair of cymbals that evoke immediately a pair of giant ears framing the picture. So you have seen everything, you have followed every detail. The audiovisual editing seems to magnify for us every single note of the cantata, but what has been lost is the, so to speak, hollowed out sound of the gunshot. This noise, which is actually the key noise or sound of the scene, this noise will be forever what we could call, with Marcel Duchamp, a bruit secret. A noise or sound that is masked, that is hidden by another, that is dissimulated in the very element of sound. Right? This is actually one of the paradoxes, so to speak, of listening that I would like to think about with you here, i.e. masking, that is to say a certain inaudibility, a certain deafness even, that inhabits the very exercise of our sense of hearing. But let us not go too fast. Let us come back to the very beginning, i.e. to the applause. What do we do when we applaud? When we clap in unison, for example, with other members of an audience, forming with them what has been called in the 19th century the claque. Applause essentially belongs to what Nietzsche called in Daybreak the art of listening, which is the art of marking, of punctuating in various ways, ranging from the 19th century practice of the claque to the actual techniques for indexing digital files, for example. All these are marking or punctuating techniques. So in order to understand how the art of listening, as Nietzsche says, might essentially be a marking and punctuating practice, I would like to briefly focus on the history of the claque. That will be the first part of the talk, beginning with this very striking paragraph in Berlioz's memoirs that I will read out for you. Then, writes Berlioz, you should have seen with what a frenzy of applause we greeted the passages which no one else noticed. A fine harmonic bass, a happy modulation, a right accent in a recitative, an expressive note in the oboe, etc. The public took us for claqueurs, aspiring to outnumber the others, whereas the real chief of the claque, who was only too well aware of the true state of affairs and whose cunning combinations were deranged by our thunders of applause, looked as furious as Neptune." End of quote. So the claque and the claqueur formed an intermediary field between the public and the staff of the Opéra in Paris. From the time the Paris Opéra was under the direction of Louis Véron, around in the 1830s, the claque was in the hands, if I may say so, of a certain Auguste Levasseur, who, in exchange for his services, received either cash from the singers or from the composer, or free tickets from the management or the artists, which he could then sell at a profit. And all this was the subject of an explicit contract. Whoever bought a ticket from Levasseur, from the chef de claque, was automatically a member of the claque. These claqueurs, whom Berlioz, in The Art of Music and Other Essays, describes as, I quote him, the system of paid applause, they were described also as, they were called also les Romains, Romans, since they supposedly reproduced an ancient Roman practice. So these claqueurs were supposed to applaud at Levasseur's command, not according to the arbitrariness of chance, but according to an in-depth study that Levasseur had made of the score by attending rehearsals regularly, by having discussions with the theater director as well as with the singers. And often, on the days of the premiere, Levasseur, or before, the day before, Levasseur decided on his plan with Véron, the director of the Opéra de Paris, after analyzing the opera, the score. On the evening of the premiere, the claqueur came in before the public in order to be better and more strategically seated. And Levasseur, who was dressed as conspicuously as possible, gave the signs for the beginning, the duration, and the intensity of the applause. So, in a way, the chef de claque was transformed into a conductor who was the mirror or double of the other, directing the public as the other one directed the musicians. The public concert, ever since it came into being, has been, in effect, a kind of mirror of listeners. It is not just a place to hear works, it is also, as we all know, a theater where the audience observes itself, in a way, or themselves. The concert is a space where we come to look at those who listen, where we go to see people listening, or even to listen to people listening. So listening to oneself listening, or listening to others listening, is also, obviously, amounts also to turning the work of musical work, into a sort of battlefield. Turning the work into a theater of maneuvers and listening operations, listening strategies, where various camps clash with each other. But this battlefield, this polemical space, where people listen to themselves listening to each other, sometimes complacently, sometimes watchfully. You know, we all watch our neighbors at the concert, how they listen in order to make sure they stay silent or they concentrate or not. In short, this theater where listeners are exhibited, this theater is subjected also to a movement of internalizing appropriation, of which we could unearth, each of us, thousands of proofs, evidence, and testimonials. I mean, we all have many claqueurs inside ourselves. Because what I would argue is that it is precisely in this way that in the very heart of our most intimate listening, the internalized voices, murmurs of the author, the claqueur, the hissers, the critics, the enthusiasts of all kinds clash with one another, each one maneuvering for a punctuation, for a phrasing of the work that conforms to his interests or convictions. In many ways, what you saw in Hitchcock's passage that I showed, in this staging of listeners in the Royal Albert Hall, is a staging of, projection on a wide space of this intimate little theater that plays inside us when we listen. Barren accesses, police negotiation, etc., etc. That's what happens inside our listening consciousness, if we want to borrow Nietzsche's expression. And that is why, that's my hypothesis, let's say, that is why the theater of the claque, with all its art, as I will show you, and all its refined strategies, has so much to tell us about what I would like to call the polemology that inhabits our inner ear, so to speak. Inside my ear, there is always already the ear of the other or the others. So I would like to read from a few short passages from the incredible memoirs that I have discovered while writing Listen, A History of Our Ears. I stumbled upon these documents, let's say, on the history of the claque. These memoirs that I'm about to quote constitute an intriguing counterpoint to the memoirs by Berlioz. Berlioz as a battling listener. So here's the title page of these memoirs published in Paris in 1829. I quote the title, Memoirs in English, Memoirs of a Claqueur, containing the theory and practice of the art of successes by Robert, Chevalier du Lustre, Commandeur de l'Ordre du Battoir, so that's impossible to translate, a knight of the house lights, something like that, and commander of the order of the Battoir. Affiliated member of several claque societies, etc. Edition published, edited, revised, and accompanied by notes by an old amateur. That's the title page. This Robert, and maybe he looked like the character depicted on the frontispiece of these memoirs, with his palms turned toward the reader and an epigraph underneath borrowed from Voltaire that says, I quote, Du monde entre mes mains j'ai vu les destinées, which we could translate as I had the fates of the world between my hands. Robert, the supposed author of these memoirs, speaks of a science of the claque. And the teaching he receives in this new profession, as he says, has all the characteristics of an initiation by a master. I quote, Then he gave me basic instructions on the science of cabals and discoursed like a skilled master on all the different tactics capable of making plays succeed or fail. I learned from him in what circumstance one should applaud or hiss, cry or laugh, be quiet or shout out, sneeze or blow one's nose. Finally, he revealed for me the most secret mysteries of his profession. End of quote. But these memoirs of a claqueur are unfortunately silent on the precise nature of the notes that the master took in the course of rehearsals. The claque, in the end, according to these memoirs, unfortunately remains an oral art, if I may say so, a tactile tactic without writing, which the old amateur, the publisher of the memoirs, himself regrets in a footnote that I quote. He writes, sometimes manuscripts on which the passages that should be applauded are indicated in the margins are given to the leaders of the claque. By means of this, the Chevalier du Lustre, again, the knights of the house lights, rehearse at home. The one who can read most fluently acts as author, and the others practice the handling of the bravos. We regret that Mr. Robert did not devote a chapter to this part of his art. End of quote. So I regret too, obviously, not having at my disposal such a historical testimony on this essential aspect of the art of listening, as Nietzsche would say, annotating in order to index, phrase, punctuate, in short, in order to appropriate what is being heard. And yet, without knowing exactly how the claqueurs 2 centuries ago annotated the works they listened to in order to appropriate them with their strategies, we know enough, I think, to conclude here that listening is essentially a battle of marks, a battle of punctuation marks, right? In order to phrase in this or that way. Now, if the art of listening is above all a punctuating practice, then the points or marks that are registered on the soundtrack of a live concert or the soundtrack of a recorded concert, for example, that doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not distinguishing here at this level of analysis between literally recorded marks or marks that are imprinted, orally on the unfolding of a live soundtrack. At this level of analysis, we can consider that's the same. It's a form of actually writing, listening, if you want. Listening as a form of archi-punctuation or archi-writing, if we want to talk, Derridian, in a Derridian lexicon. So these points or marks that are registered on the soundtrack in order to engrave on the soundtrack what I would call a signed listening, so a listening that has been appropriated in such and such a way, a phrased listening, we could say. Well, these points have a very remarkable structure that I would like to show you briefly by showing you another very short clip by Alfred Hitchcock, maybe from a strictly oral or sonorous point of view. That's my favorite scene in Hitchcock. It's actually quite wonderful. So it's a passage in Hitchcock's Torn Curtain, 1966, where you can, in a way, see and hear the matrix, or I would say the pure geometry of this punctuating structure at work in listening. Just to situate the passage, we are in the context of the Cold War. You will see Professor Michael Armstrong, that's the name of the character played by Paul Newman, who is an esteemed scientist who has become a double agent at the service of the American government. You will see him in East Berlin while he seeks to establish contact with a professor in the East. You will see him as he's trying to outrun a spy who is tracking him, someone from the East German security agency. So you will see Armstrong, Paul Newman, enter a museum, quickly cross the rooms where artworks are displayed without ever looking at them. The point is not really the visual. For what he's desperately seeking to do is to escape his pursuer. And this is the point at which, as you will notice, in this movie, which seems to promise, by way of its title, a visual revelation, Torn Curtain, while also obviously alluding to the Iron Curtain of the time. Here, the soundtrack takes totally over. The soundtrack takes the lead, so to speak, and sets the pace. Notice how Hitchcock is preparing the floor, in a way, wiping it clean as if it were a blackboard on which to write or imprint marks later on in the scene. So this sequence always seems to me like a transcription or transposition for feet, if I may say so, of the famous Steve Reich piece, clapping music. But seriously, in the museum, in this place devoted to the cult of seeing, we do not see the spy anymore, except for his shadow that briefly appears in one shot. What we hear instead is the sound of his footsteps, exaggeratedly amplified as he walks on the resonant floor of the exhibition rooms. But the spy's footsteps mix in, so they blend and become confused with Armstrong's footsteps. And we, who follow them on the screen, we hold our breath, listening to Armstrong, listening to the footsteps of the spy tracking him, and to be able to hear, he has to stop, he has to stand still, risking to get caught so that his own footsteps do not mask the footsteps of the other. So what I want to suggest, what this scene gives us to think about is that if listening is essentially a question of marking or remarking, so if listeners always perform a sort of clapping counter music, be it loud or quasi-silent, be it an external theatrical clapping like the clack, or be it silent in our mind, well, this marking, as such, is always already a masking in the very movement of its inscription. And I would argue that such is the law of oral punctuation, of what we might call points of hearing. So there are marks and maskings at the same time. Professor Armstrong, as I said in Hitchcock's Torn Curtain, has to stop in order to hear the footsteps of the agent following him. And these punctuation marks, or these punctuating stops or dots that mark and mask, they are always deaf spots. It's the same, with the cymbal clash, it's the same with applause. They overlap, and as such they mask what is to be heard, while at the same time demarcating it and emphasizing it. So that's what I would suggest to call the punctum surdum, obviously an expression that is modeled on the punctum cecum at the center of the retina. I don't really have time to develop that now, but what this suggests is that in order to be orally signed or appropriated, the music or the soundtrack has to be in a way muted in the very moments of inscription of these auditory marks. Now, in order to head toward a conclusion, I would like to consider the analogy that I have been suggesting, i.e. the analogy between listening and punctuation, to consider this analogy for its own sake and to interrogate it as such in order to better grasp maybe what is at stake in what I would call the performative dimension of the art of listening. So we know that according to a theory that was defended with conviction among others by Leo Treitler, musicologist Leo Treitler, the first form of Western musical notation, i.e. what is known as the neumes, could have emerged from punctuation marks. I very briefly call Treitler. He writes, the basic elements of Carolingian systems of punctuation in use before 800 are the point, the comma, the virgule, and the question mark, of which there are numerous forms. The point and comma could be multiplied and different elements could be combined. It can be seen at first glance that almost all of the elementary signs and many of the compound ones as well, came to be used as neumes from the 9th century. That's the neumes are the first Western musical notation for for Gregorian chant. And that, Treitler continues, seems like, I never know how to pronounce Latin in English, prima facie evidence that punctuation signs are a factor in the genesis of the neumes, i.e. in the genesis of musical notation in the West. End of quote. So what should give us pause, though, is not this close intertwining of the respective histories of punctuation marks and musical notation. It is rather the concept of phrasing, as Nietzsche evokes it in a number of passages, for example, in the case of Wagner in paragraph 11, where after having credited, or rather criticized Wagner for introducing the actor in music, i.e., as you all know, dramatization or theatricality in performance, Nietzsche writes, I quote, "The movement Wagner created extends even into the realm of knowledge. Disciplines related to the movement are slowly emerging out of centuries-old scholasticism. As an example, I would single out Riemann's distinguished work on rhythm. He was the first to apply the concept of punctuation, den Hauptbegriff der Interpunktion in German, to music, unfortunately using an ugly term. He called it phrasing, Phrasierung. Now, the musicologist Hugo Riemann collaborated with Nietzsche's friend, the composer, pianist, and critic Karl Fuchs. Together, they wrote a catechism of phrasing, that was the title, Catechismus der Phrasierung, published in Leipzig in 1890. And in a letter to Karl Fuchs, dated 1888, the same year that saw the publication of the Case of Wagner, Nietzsche goes into more details about the fascinating power, or dangerous counterpower, if you prefer, of phrasing. So let me quote a long sentence from this letter. It's just one sentence, but you will see how sinuous it is. I translated it as literally as possible. It's not included in the translated Nietzsche correspondence in English. And you will notice how what Nietzsche describes in terms of the power of punctuation, or this dangerous counter-power of punctuation as phrasing, is in a way unwittingly maybe mimicked in the very syntactic structure of this long sentence. So Nietzsche writes, I quote, you have the German underneath for those who want, "This animation," so I have to take a deep breath because it's a long sentence, "This animation, this enlivening of the minutest parts of the discourse of music, I wish that you and Riemann would apply the words that everyone knows from rhetoric, period, sentence, colon, comma, according to their size, also interrogative sentence, conditional sentence, imperative, since the theory of phrasing is ultimately that equivalent of punctuation for prose and poetry. Therefore, we observed this animation and enlivening of the minutest parts as they belong in music to the praxis of Wagner, and from there have almost become a ruling system of performance even for singers and actors, with similar phenomena in other art forms. It is a typical symptom of decline, evidence for the fact that life has withdrawn from the whole and is luxuriating in the smallest elements." End of quote. So, leaving aside the positive or negative evaluation that it elicits on Nietzsche's part, it is this enlivening capacity of punctuation in music that interests me here. And not only in performance, as Nietzsche considers here, but also in what I would call the performative acts of listening. Nietzsche is not the only thinker who emphasized the importance, for better or for worse, of the concept of punctuation in music. Adorno, in an essay entitled Punctuation Marks, and included in the first volume of his Notes to Literature, Adorno suggests that, I quote, "there is no element in which language resembles music more than in the punctuation marks." I quote, "The comma and the period correspond to the half cadence and the authentic cadence. Exclamation points are like silent cymbal clashes, like a silent version of The Man Who Knew Too Much. Question marks like musical upbeats, colons, dominant seventh chords, etc. And only a person who can perceive the different weights of strong and weak phrasings in musical form can really feel the distinction between the comma and the semicolon. End of quote. We can find a striking echo of these remarks in a series of notes that were published only after Adorno's death under the title Towards a Theory of Musical Reproduction. Maybe some of you know this text, fascinating text. After some sketchy considerations about the origins of Western musical notation, Adorno evokes the development of mere accent markings to complicated neumes. Well, Adorno writes in a long parenthesis that I quote, "Perhaps," he says, "the point of intersection between musical and verbal writing is the punctuation mark. And this could be connected to the passage stating that music knows letters and sentences, but not words." End of quote. So the passage in question, to which Adorno alludes, is sketched out a few pages earlier in the draft of this theory of musical reproduction, and in the following terms. I quote this and I conclude. Adorno writes, "The written language of music is one devoid of intention, a blind nomenclature, so to speak, and the units of sense within which music itself operates have nothing in common with intentionality. Music is a non-intentional language. One can indeed speak of phonemes in music, and on the other hand, with good unmetaphorical reasons about periods and sentences, but never of words." Transposing these thoughts to listening as a form of punctuation practiced or performed by the claqueurs, for example, these virtuosos that we encountered in Berlioz's or in Robert's memoirs, we should say that the art of listening is not so much concerned with sense, with the sense or meaning of sound, but rather with its phrasing. Punctuation might be the precondition for the production of sense, for meaning or reference, but it is not meaningful in itself. What would a comma, a period, or a colon signify? What would an applause signify? But, I mean, it's an interruption. But the meaninglessness of auditory punctuation marks do not imply that their use is simply arbitrary or that one could distribute them orally without being held responsible for their effects. On the contrary, in the conversation about music that I quoted at the beginning of this talk, in the very passage that mentions, I quote again, the conscience of the art of listening, Nietzsche, who would have certainly hated the claqueurs and despised their tactics as a symptom of decay, Nietzsche goes as far as to say, thereby recognizing their power or counterpower, I quote, "Whenever you cheer and clap, you have the artist's conscience in your hands." Thank you very much.
10 minutes? I want to open it up. Just permit me one little comment, which I hope isn't too much of a downer, but we've gone through the Stephen Paddock. I couldn't help thinking, watching the Hitchcock, that there was this very grim relationship between the arming of the sound, which is anticipated by Doris Day, right? She's anticipating, so she has to, in a sense, mask with the scream and a sound that had a shot. So I mean, it's a vague question, but it's something to do with the arming of sound, the relationship between a shot and its punctuation, and the question also of anticipation. Not well formulated, but I just had to get it off my chest because couldn't help
Oh, yeah.
filter
I
that
can,
Hitchcock scene through what we've just been through. So
yes, yeah. No, thank you for this, how can I say, powerful association. And it's more than an association. In a way, yes, I like your expression and suggestion, the arming of sound. And obviously we'll have the recent tragic events in mind. So without the least trying to relativize or downplay the importance of what happened, which is the sad, tragic repetition of what continues to happen and will continue to happen if nothing happens. I would also say that sound, in a way, is always armed, you know, and that there is always a responsibility in listening, in what I would call performative listening acts, precisely for that reason. You could find many examples. Obviously, if, as I suggest, listening is a way of punctuating by marking and at the same time masking, then everything that you mark, punctuate, emphasize while listening, you also mask. So it's always a negotiation between drawing attention to, for oneself or for someone else, as in the case of the claqueurs. So basically the claqueurs draw attention on a certain sonic event for another part of the audience, right? So there is a sort of triangulation in this listening situation. It's not just the listener face to face with the supposed sonic object in a sort of immediate lending of our ears, as if there were no one else, as the classical concert stage or scene makes us believe. You know, that's the great fantasy of classical concert listening. But that's also what we fantasize in everyday life. You know, I'm all ears. I listen to you, and that's the we think of that as the utmost paradigm of listening. But on what the claqueurs teach us, I would argue, is that there is a structural triangulation of the listening situation that involves the other, be it this, other recognizable other, the claqueur, who will draw my attention to a certain sonic passage by phrasing it, framing it, etc. for me. And this is always a polemological gesture or strategy, because it clashes immediately with my phrasing, you know. So in a way, the listening situation is always already a battlefield, I would argue. Obviously not the same, and it can turn out to be a battlefield for good reasons, for bad reasons. It can be a repressed battlefield. It can be many kinds of battlefield. But I think we have to, we need to let this polemological structure of listening emerge, because that's where we can begin to think of listening as being a matter of responsibility. It's only if you define listening as a performative act, conscious, unconscious, whatever, that you can begin to think about listening as involving ethics, responsibility, decisions, that you can begin to ask the question, what do I do when I listen? That's the precondition, setting the stage or the ground for thinking of listening in terms of responsibility. So thank you for this association.
if there are more than one question, why don't we hear them all, so at least we have a sense and...
Thank you for a magnificent presentation. I have a question about the definition of punctuating and the art of listening related to each other. I was wondering whether, I'm thinking of situations in which actually you are unable to punctuate. For instance, you are in front of a new phenomenon, as an example, particularly complex polyrhythmical music. You are in Macedonia, you hear folk music, part of the band plays in 7, part on 11, you tried counting, you cannot. And similarly, whenever you are in front of relatively new musical phenomena, you feel that the application of older structures that you already know is either very stretched or impossible. You try to punctuate, but cannot. I personally associate this type of situations with very powerful moments of musical experience. A German word comes to mind that is used for this particular state of being seized by music, Ergriffenheit, so when you are really taken by it. And I would perhaps argue that exactly there, where the capability of punctuating is temporarily diffused, lies a certain art of listening, because you are left only with that device, with the listening, without punctuating.
Sorry, we have 3 minutes now.
Okay. Okay. Shall I answer?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we don't have time for more, sorry.
So thank you for this wonderful question. Actually, it calls to my mind a certain passage in Adorno's sketch for a theory of reproduction, where he talks about the phrasing of new music and how difficult it is, how wrong or faulty it usually is, because precisely performers, and I would obviously extend that to listeners as performers in a way, don't know where to put a comma or a period, where to put a question mark, where to close a parenthesis, etc. So he really describes the challenge, the well-known challenge of performing so-called new music, what we call new music, as in terms of punctuation. And I'm also thinking about this incredible moment, this event when Webern's piano variations were edited with his supposedly, comments and oral instructions by, who was it, Peter Stadlen, I think, the pianist who rehearsed with Webern. And that was a totally new way that we all discovered, of punctuating, of phrasing so-called new music that Pierre Boulez had interpreted in a very pointillistic way, and all of a sudden it seemed like almost a Viennese waltzer. And so, but what is really interesting in your question and really challenging is that you suggest that it's precisely the inability to punctuate, if I understood you correctly, that is the point in all the senses of the word in English, the point of listening. I would agree in a way, and I wonder how we could translate your question in my terms or vice versa. What I mean is how we could translate that in terms of this punctum surdum, right? When you are not able to punctuate, not able to appropriate, when in a way you don't listen because you're unable to do anything. And maybe that's precisely when listening is paradoxically at its height in a way, right? So maybe that's where we should, look for an answer that I don't have. Thank you.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time, but we're going to make Peter submit to another round of claqueurs. Thank you so much.